Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Prayers of Fly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Telegram, Facebook, and Twitter. And support me on Subscribestar, Buy Me a Coffee, and Locals. And don't forget to check out my Substack. All right, so I'm here with Logos again today. I asked him to watch my video on Foundations of Philosophy that I did last Thursday. And we would sort of... He's really good at coming up with what other schools of thought might find objectionable. And so he's sort of this like universal middleman. So we're gonna do some of that. So you got your slideshow ready, Logos?
I do.
All right, let's go.
Okay. So before I start, two important things. Many people in the audience probably know me, but some don't. So I'm going to reiterate it again. I am not a materialist. And I am here giving these rebuttals because I was asked to do so. Don't shoot the messenger. Okay. Those two things out of the way. This is what I came up with after watching Todd's talk. Okay. So the first big point that stuck out to me was the argument that the body can be doubted, but the mind cannot. The thought experiment we're considering here is a possible world where you wake up in the body of an animal, but your thoughts are still yours. So Todd used Kafka's Metamorphosis as an example where he wakes up in the body of a beetle. Now, the argument is being able to imagine these scenarios shows that the mind isn't analytically identical to the brain because there's no contradiction in substituting in your mind in situations where your brain is otherwise. Your brain is not the beetle's brain, and yet here you are in the beetle's body. So what's the response to this? After looking up SEP, talking to physicalists and whatnot, I have a bunch on my server. The main point they seem to agree on is that, the physicalism isn't committed to saying that a brain-mind relationship is an analytic identity subject to Leibniz's law. So Leibniz's law of identity is basically conditions where you can analytically substitute one term for another in a sentence and kind of preserve all meaning. It's a very, very strict criteria. And physicalists don't see mind-to-brain relations necessarily. Some do, but it's kind of a fringe position that has a lot of other problems besides Leibniz's law problems. Most physicalists that I know of, actually talk to, wouldn't take an identity view. They take a much more general view we'll talk about later. Well, actually, we'll talk about it now. So some examples would be like supervenience physicalism, grounding physicalism, fundamentality physicalism, emergent physicalism as a subset of any of these, basically leans into the fact that there is no identity between mind and brain. In fact, there is no part of the brain you can carve up and say, like, this is the brain part that corresponds to some mental state. The brain as a system probably is producing more complex outcomes than we can possibly understand, and trying to untangle any part of the system will have butterfly effect ramifications we won't fully understand. And so we know that in some sense it pops out, but they're skeptical that we'll ever know how it does so. So that's the first point we can stop at, is that there are physicalists that aren't identity physicalists.
Right. So a couple things here. One, we've talked about privately before, like emergent. No, not emergentism. Well, what's the physicalist position where mental effects are just like letting steam out of a vent?
Oh, you're talking about the... Oh, that's such a weird word. I always forget it until I randomly remember it.
Yeah. You're not talking about them, are you? Because they technically would be physicalists too.
Yeah, they're definitely a type of physicalists, and a lot of like evolutionary arguments against naturalism like target those people, like Maverick Christian. He has a paper that really goes after those people as he should.
Okay.
I forgot what it's called.
I want to say emergentism, but that's not it. That's something else.
Yeah, no. This is it's like non-cognitivism. It's not that. It's something. I can look it up.
That's fine. Yeah, that's not the key thing. Would you agree though that reductive physicalism is the dominant form that we experience, especially like in the scientific academy?
Oh yeah, absolutely. All the examples I gave here in the bullet points are examples of reductive physicalism. The question is, what is the reducibility operation? So for example, Supervenience physicalism is something like the analogy given is something like you have a bunch of dots on a paper, and when you zoom out from all those dots, you're getting like some really cool, elaborate tapestry or picture. And so there is some sense in which the tapestry is the dots, but there's another sense in which no individual dots are the tapestry, right? So it's more complicated. Grounding physicalism is kind of like a foundational thing where like imagine like our mental processes being a house, and the physical brain stuff is the foundation the house sits on. And so what the reductive physicalist is saying basically is we can reduce the stuff going, well, we can reduce the fact that there is a house to the fact that it hasn't sunk into quicksand, so to speak. And so they'd have a reductive relation in terms of grounding. And there's all different kinds. And so there's like, there's ways that you can reduce physical stuff, but the reductive operation could be different depending on the type.
Right, but let me rephrase this. The idea that all mental states can be reducible to brain states, at least in my experience, is the dominant physicalist position.
Yeah.
All right.
That's true. That's physicalism, yeah.
Right. Okay. So I guess what we can say here is more clarification was needed, because yeah, there are in the realm of in the discussion of like the philosophy of science, philosophy of mind, philosophy generally, there are other physicalist schools, but what I was using as a shorthand was the dominant classic new atheist position of all mental states can be reducible to brain states. Now, would you agree that kind of physicalism is challenged by the indubitability of the mind?
Not necessarily. Because here's an analogy I'm going to come back to over and over again, because I think it's really clarifying. Suppose one were to say something like, we can reduce market equilibria in economics to the sum of individuals and their decisions who comprise the market. That is a kind of reducibility they could have in mind, and yet that's not really an identity kind of reducibility. You're not saying they're the same or they're identical, but you are saying behind every market transaction, there are a bunch of buyers and sellers negotiating prices. You see what I'm saying?
Right, right. Okay, so I'll get back to this point in a moment, but I want to go back to Kafka. The Kafka element wasn't fully expressed, I think, correctly, because what the specific appeal that I remember is there was a discussion that I saw planning to have with an atheist there was some atheist guy doing where he did like a video, a documentary where we talked to all these different theologians on why they believe in God. And he's like a church in pews sitting with Plantinga. And Plantinga's making a modal argument saying that, well, if it's possibly that you could doubt my mind, but not possible that you could doubt it's possible you could doubt my body, but not possible you doubt my mind, then you don't have, they lack identity because they lack this modal property. Now, he's making an argument in that context that because the mind and the body, or the brain in this case, lack modal properties, are not identical. And one of the things that they lack is that the body or brain is dubitable. But the other thing is, in order to, the implications of what the indubitability of the mind means are a whole other set of things. But the point here is, though, that the mind itself this is an attack on mind-brain identity based on the philosophy of mind. And the other problem is, I don't see how the other physicalist positions can account for the fact, for the other I, indivisibility. If mental states are just another type of physical phenomena, okay, fine, I'll grant you that. Just like, my exhalation of air when I breathe isn't the same as my heartbeat. Okay, fine, it's another material phenomena. Where is it? They can't tell you where it is. You can't cut it up. You can't measure it. It doesn't have any, because if we believe that energy and matter are convertible, so electricity, you can't actually weigh it, but you can still measure it and track it with other instruments. Where is it? They don't tell you where the mind or the mental processes are happening.
Exactly. And it's exactly this physicalist critique of physicalists that resulted in the emergentist school. They take that, or yeah, the emergentist school, they take that very seriously. You in fact cannot divide up the mental outcomes by dividing any part of the brain. And so their entire shtick basically in physicalism is the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. You'll never get the whole by taking any of its parts and doing that sort of thing. It's almost like saying, going back to the market analogy, if the market is in some sense reducible to the individuals and choices in the market, can we, I don't know, figure out 1/3 of the price of bread by taking 1/3 of the individuals out of the market or something like that? And they'd say no, because taking out 1/3 of the individuals of the market, buyers and sellers or something, might make an equilibrium, but it might not account for 1/3 of what the equilibrium was. In some sense, it's more complicated than them and more complicated than any divisible part of them.
Right, but I'm making an actually stronger claim. I'll use the example you just gave. We can right. So the example you just gave was we can't remove a third of the population and then determine what the price of bread will be. But we still do know, for whatever reason, based on the complex interactions of the market, what the price of bread is. The problem is, with any given mental state, we don't even know that. Where is it? Like, okay, the price of bread might be listed on the stock market. It might be listed in your grocery store. We know where it is. But where is the physical manifestation of my memory of yesterday's lunch? It's nowhere.
Oh, yeah, they would say it's in the nervous system somewhere, which is how they can induce short-term memory loss in people by shutting off certain nerve clusters in the brain.
I mean, the problem I see with that, though, is I haven't actually done the serious, rigorous work it would need to show this, but I have a pretty good feeling that for any given mental qualia state, more than one could trigger the same physical stimuli. And in which case, how could you differentiate between the two then? Because if we look at a set of all possible mental states and then a set of all possible brain states, I think, especially if you read literature and philosophy, you're going to see that there's way more mental states than there could ever be brain states.
Exactly. And this, again, is why emergentism is one of the more popular physicalist views. Because the system and all its permutations is bigger than the sum of its parts. You can't just look at the system or in each of its parts individually. You have to look at like every possible permutation of parts interacting with every other permutation of parts. So it's kind of like a factorial thing, right? You've got n objects. But if you've got like, ways of permuting those n objects, you've got like n factorial ways of doing it. And each of those could produce its own outcomes.
Well, right. But I don't see how, with the knowledge we have of either the nervous system or the brain, any just so physical description of any individual human could account for where those things are. I'm not even talking about how they're generated, which is another problem. I'm just talking about where are they? Like with a computer, you could go into the hard drive files and find discrete things. And it's like, okay, well, it's in that part of the computer hard drive. Okay, well, we all sort of know what that means. But where's my memory? Like, where is that in me? Like, nobody knows. Nobody could point to that. Nobody could hook me up to a wire and then, go through my hard drive and find it.
Yeah, and I think this is getting at one of the other problems you were talking about, which is it's not indivisibility or indubitability. It's
Incorrigibility.
Incorrigibility. This is getting to the private one, and that I think is the current frontier and what neuroscientists are dealing with more. I read an article recently about this. I want to say 5 days ago. It just showed up on my Google News feed that showed a video of like some people doing some brain experiments where they'd hook people up and tell them to think about a vase, and they'd be kind of like not super specific on like the color of the vase and stuff like that. They're like, it should have these characteristics, but the color and everything else would be up to you. And they'd think of the vase with these like nodes in their head, and then a picture of the vase would show up on the screen. And they did the researchers to see if they were getting it right, would ask them questions. Okay, what color was the vase you were thinking of? Blah, 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 blah. And they checked to make sure it was like the picture they were seeing. And at the end, they'd show the picture to the person who was thinking of the vase. They'd be like, oh my goodness, that's the vase I was thinking of. So I don't think it's going to solve all the problems. Probably you're not going to be able to find literally everything out, at least if the emergentists are right. But I do think we're making pretty good progress.
Well, I don't want to belabor this point too much longer because you have what, 3 other parts to go through?
Yeah, we got quite a bit.
Okay, let's keep going then. Yeah.
Oh, forgot to unmute myself. Okay. So grounding physicalism, we kind of talked about this, right? Grounding physicalism would just say that in this possible world Kafka's imagining, he's imagining a world in which a physical beetle brain would have the raw fundamental stuff. There'd be psychophysical laws that would allow Kafka to be in this beetle's mind. We already talked about that a little, so we'll move on for the sake of time. So the next question is about possible worlds, and the question of like physical versus metaphysical possibility. And so here's another attack that would be done without attacking, say, the identity argument. Let's put that off to the side for a second. When are these thought experiments about what could be forceful? And so if we restrict this to, say, physical laws, like say our psychophysical laws, our physical facts of the world, and so on, does this thought experiment shed any light on what might be true, say, in our world instead of Kafka's possible world of the beetle? And here are some counterexamples, which I think they would bring up to say that the experiment doesn't have much force. So, for example, if I suffer sufficient brain trauma, I'd be a different person. So the example would be Phineas Gage. The guy had a railroad spike through his head. They were able to save him, but his personality was radically different. Some of his relatives were like, I just don't know him anymore. I don't recognize him. And this happens all the time with blunt force trauma and car accidents, things like that. You hit certain parts of the brain and boom, you wake up knowing another language sometimes in crazy cases. And so via our own physical laws, we can imagine waking up in our own body 2 days from now, having had an accident and not being a copy of us in our own body. And also, some human beings cannot solve the breakfast problem, as you and I joke about sometimes, and nor do they have internal dialogues. I mean, a lot of people are shocked to figure out like how many people don't actually like communicate with voices in their head. But I claim it's essential to me or you that, we be able to do these things because we can. And so let's suppose we were born into the body of another human being without the brain architecture to manage these things. I don't think we'd be us. We'd be a projection of us onto somebody else as best as it can be, but it wouldn't be, fully us. And the last point is, man is a rational animal for a reason. So can we, in the real world, just, project ourselves into an animal and inherit our rational faculties? Aristotle might say no, because animals aren't men. So that would be another way the physicalist might look at this thought experiment.
Right. So I think to briefly handle this, I would agree that the beetle brain, to the extent that it has a brain, wouldn't allow any human's mind to operate effectively in it, nor other lower animals. But I think maybe you thought I was saying more or less than I was. What I was using the indubitability argument for was 2 things. To argue that the mind is a different substance than the brain, because and that was one argument of 2 others that were used to make that point. And given that the brain, or the mind rather, is indubitable, it creates a foundation for being over time, in the sense that, if all the cells in your body change every X number of years, well, then what's you over time? There's that. And now if we add the Christian element to it, which I did not, because this was not supposed to be like intentionally referring to Christianity, the general consensus is when you die as a Christian, you go to the afterlife of heaven. And so you don't have a body. And so while your body's important and Christians believe in the resurrection, there is a time where you can exist and still be you without a body. So in at least in the Christian model, you can still be you without a body. And then lastly, with the issue of just the doubting the mind, this especially with like incorrigibility, if I'm getting stabbed and I tell you I'm in pain, I can't be wrong about the fact that I'm in pain. And so the importance of establishing the indubitability of the mind is that, at least what I was trying to communicate by that was, there are certain things that to be true without having to second guess yourself. You can just start with these as basic axioms or assumptions or data, and then just move on. That's really the key point. that I think Descartes is trying to get at, and then I'm trying to get at with the indubitability of the mind.
Okay. Yeah. Josh Rasmussen likes to make that the last argument a lot. You know, one of his favorite things to talk about in philosophy of mind. I think he leans more, I don't want to say idealist. He doesn't really accept that label, but he's definitely more monist of some kind. You know, what he likes to say is, I can't doubt the appearance of my mental processes, right? And so if you want to describe all this brain stuff happening that supports it, I can't interact with that brain stuff. I just don't know how, never been able to know how, but I can think about a pink elephant just like that. And so whatever I have access to seems to be more real than the stuff that you're asking me to imagine. And I think that's a pretty interesting argument, that we have more access to the outcomes than we do ostensibly to the machine that produces them, which is pretty interesting because that's just not how it works in real life, right? Usually if we want to get something from a machine, we have to interact with the machine's interface to you know, finagle it to generate the outcomes we want. We have to type on the keyboard, enter the command code, whatever. But the brain, if it works like a machine, doesn't seem to work that way. It seems like we can just like jump straight to outcome, you know, without having to follow the machine's own rules. And that's something a lot of philosophers of mind have noticed. So that's a good point.
Yeah, no, but yeah, please continue.
Okay. So let's skip that one because we already did. So the next big part of the thing was the empiricist dilemma. So if all objects of the mind originated the senses, and furthermore they assert the idea that there is no sense data to create the idea of God, then where did the idea of God come from? And I note that this is actually a dilemma. So either we reject that all objects of the mind originate in the senses, or we have to accept that the idea of God originates in the senses, making God consistent with an empiricist epistemology. So empiricists are going to have to accept the first horn because there's no way they're going to accept the second one. I mean, it's one of the reasons why they're empiricists. I mean, that's probably uncharitable. They'll get mad at me for saying that, but you know what? I don't care. So anyway, so what the empiricists will want to say about the first horn is something more specific. They'll want to say that nothing is known in the mind without having first been in the senses. So there can be all sorts of things in our mind that don't correspond to things we know. Artifacts of fiction, Gettier cases for epistemology. You know, we can have all sorts of objects in the mind, but what they're more concerned with is epistemology, and specifically they're more concerned with justification, right? So let's suppose two philosophies, A and B, are describing two different inconsistent things about the world. The empiricists would want to say, well, hey, let's get out of the armchair and do experiments or something to figure out what's going on. And if we can't, that's where the pragmatist steps in and says, well, if there's no real world distinction between what's being argued about, then who cares? And that was the pragmatist kind of sprinkle in there. I think that was Peirce that had that addendum. Anyway, so that's their big thing, is they're more concerned with justification. So if we think that things in our mind are justified, no, if we think we're justified in things being in our mind corresponding to real things, then there has to be some ultimate sensory explanation for that justification, is basically what they're trying to get at.
Right, but even if you have a false belief, since they do not believe in innate ideas, it must have come from the senses.
They don't believe in. It's interesting.
No, the only way you could have a mental object in your mind without sense perception is innate ideas, and an empiricist will explicitly reject that.
That's interesting. So there are a lot of empiricists today that would accept innate ideas for sure, because he thinks that there are some ideas like preloaded into human brains through evolution, language, so on. So I'm pretty sure there's some empiricists that might.
Okay, well let me make this point. Maybe this will help.
Okay.
I conceptually make a distinction between, quote, strong and weak empiricists. A strong empiricist would be like, you know, Aristotle, Aquinas, and Hume. You know, nothing exists in the intellect that did not first exist in the senses. Now, I guess you could say a Thomist would be the empiricist who does take the other fork and says, yeah, of course, I can sense God through my senses. And that would be the one empiricist taking the other fork, a Thomist. But you could envision a weak empiricist that does believe in some sort of either innate idea or some sort of a priori synthetic reasoning, but for whatever reason doesn't still elevates empirical observation to a higher degree, such a person could exist, and maybe more of them do now. But at least in my experience, both reading the literature and engaging with them online, is they generally tend to be strong empiricists.
That's kind of interesting. I mean, I think I've seen some purportedly strong empiricists. So the first thing I thought of when I saw your dilemma was actually John Stuart Mill and his expression of where math comes from. So he thought that no matter how complex our math ideas got, we should be able to boil them down to addition, and we can boil addition down to like our senses. And I think he's wrong about that. But I was talking to people about Mill, and they're like, no, you're reading Mill wrong. What Mill's actually saying is more of a nominalist point, that insofar as we think math's useful for anything, Mill would probably agree that mathematicians could make up all sorts of useless stuff that doesn't matter. But I think what Mill is getting at is we can think of math as useful and applicable to the world by doing this whole thing going back to, here's addition, here's how math works in the world, and then one-to-one, there's got to be a reason it works all the way up. So he actually ends up making more of a nominalist point than a strong empiricist point. And so I guess that line gets really blurry for me, because a lot of people sound strong empiricist. It could be a Mott and Bailey. I mean, let's to your credit.
It could be.
It could be, and probably is in a lot of cases, where they make this point, which sounds really, really good, and you ask them questions, and they'll retreat to some form of weak empiricist nominalism, or not. Yeah, nominalism. Yeah, mathematical nominalism, something like that. And that's where you start getting these distinctions popping up. And so, yeah, I think we're in agreement there.
All right, cool. Keep going.
Okay. So I just expanded on the point, but I think we don't need to belabor that too much, because I think we agree on where this is going. Okay, so the last part of the talk was the grounding argument for empiricism. So there are 4 points. We must be able to trust our senses. Space must exist. Minds that process data must exist. We must have a way to form mental trains of thought between data and observation. So space and minds. So space and minds are not contentious to the empiricists. I mean, the eliminative materialists are memed as saying there are no such things as minds and mental phenomena and so on. It's all folk psychology. All they really mean by it is, yes, you're having the apprehensions, you're experiencing what you experience, but what we really need to do is break down the language to scientific rather than folk psychological terms or something like that. But in terms of like the raw phenomena themselves, I think they have to agree with that. So the only thing that might be contentious is the first point, the question of, can we trust our senses? And this is a contentious point, because this points immediately to Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism. That's been stated, revived numerous times, all sorts of ways in the Christian atheist discussion. So the only thing I can add to this part is maybe a discussion on this one. So can we trust our senses? The empiricists will want to say, can we trust our senses to be fooled? Yeah, regularly. Optical illusions, magicians, all sorts of things trick our senses all the time. And so the entire point of empiricism is to make a robust scientific methodology where I know every step you do in the experiment. I should be able to do every step you do in the experiment. I should get the same results. Neither of us can be tricked or fooled. If we think there's something fishy, we have to be able to analyze the details and figure out why. It's also, we've talked about this a bunch, why the quest for technology is so severe. Microscopes and germ theory, telescopes and celestial stuff going on. You can only do so much with what you can see. And so empiricism has this drive to always have more and more technology to see better and better. So, I mean, empiricists have to, historically, as a matter of history, they have to accept the fallibility of our senses, at least in the face value sense. Otherwise, why would we need microscopes and particle colliders and things like that to see where we can't? But the real question, I think, is whether our senses point to anything true or real. It's kind of like a, are we in the Matrix kind of question. So far, so good?
No, yeah.
Okay, just making sure, because I went on a little bit of rant there. So, yeah. So I think in this regard, the empiricist is going to kind of shrug. Do we trust that our senses are ultimately pointing to something real? I think what they'd say, I think I've heard them say quippily in some videos, and I'm not a big fan of this response in total, but I kind of sympathize with parts of it being a pragmatist. They'd say that, if we're in the Matrix, it's probably beyond our ken to know if we're in the Matrix. Realistically, Morpheus ain't going to swoop down tomorrow and be like, "You're living in a dream world, Neo. Come take a pill." The best we're going to be able to do is just predict what the program is going to do. So based on cause and effect, what happens today and tomorrow, so on, all of it can be real. But if we can make it totally predictable to build human civilization or whatever we're doing in the Matrix, that's probably the best we're going to be able to get.
Okay. There's one thing that I want, before I answer, I want to read from the private post you sent me, which I think is going to condition how I respond to this. This, of course, kicks the can down the road. The meta question being asked here is whether the quest to fine-tune our sense information is to be more pure, leads to the discovery of anything real at the end of it. And I mean, that's kind of the point. Well, then why are you doing this? Right? Then why are you doing this if you don't have any guarantee? And furthermore, what grounds do you have to do it at all? Right? So there's two things, right? One is a utilitarian argument. Well, if it doesn't actually lead to more accurate knowledge or a better understanding of the world, because last I heard from Magic Science Man and all the Magic Science Men is that this is a way to discover truth, boys and girls. Well, then why bother? And then two, the problem is for justification, because empiricism is going to have to do one of two things. The ones that are the, capital E empiricists, they're going to say that either, when confronted with a dilemma similar to this, well, it works. Empiricism, we do it because it works. Well, that's the fallacy of circular reasoning. You can't do that. Or they'll just say, well, we don't have any justification, which is entirely unsatisfying, because for a rationalist to say he has no rational reason to do what he does, he just kind of sawed off the branch he was sitting on.
I mean, this is just going to be two different ways of looking at the world. The first question, not to sound too Jordan Peterson-like, is going to be, what is the world? And the second question is going to be, what is true with regard to the world? If you're in the Matrix, and it is true that at 2 p.m. on Thursday, the temperature is going to be 90 degrees in your city, and you can predict that with meteorology, say, that truth is the truth, even if you're not, even if it's not the real world, it's as true is going to get in that one, right? And so I think empiricists have developed a more pragmatic theory of truth, where truth is what you act out or can act out, right? If you can't get outside the Matrix, then talking about any other sort of truth where, nothing's actionable, you're not going to know or be able to do anything, it's a fool's errand, because what could possibly come from such questions or conversations? And so they restrict the world to what they can see, can do, can act out, and they restrict what's true of that world to, well, basically it's a coherentist epistemology, where each thing they believe has to be coherent with all the other things they observe and believe in the world, and you get this whole developing web of belief, blah, 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 blah. And so that seems to be the fundamental difference between where you two are coming from.
Right, but if we tie this all back to Descartes' cogito, though, because he sort of anticipates this, right? He sort of anticipates the Matrix with this evil demon deceiving us all the time. I think this is the fundamental distinction between what Descartes and more broadly the rationalist school of philosophy, and in particular with this being epistemology, foundationalism is trying to do, is to ground not only knowledge itself, but the reasoning processes in things independent of sense. Because if you can't do that, then yeah, you're stuck absolutely where you said we're stuck. But then that just begs, so at that point, then why bother doing anything at all? That's your hobby, that's my hobby, just, move on. But you, even in the Matrix scenario, the one thing you can know are certain incorrigible truths about your experience. Also that you are this being, this mind, which is able to have these experiences, even the experience of being deceived. And once you do that, that's a sort of escape hatch out of this trap.
I mean, is it? I mean, I'm not sure that just knowing that you have a subjective mental experience is any bulwark against the matrix. And that's one thing that Descartes, couldn't predict of the matrix, right? I mean, Neo had a subjective mental experience through, most of the first movie. And then when Morpheus helped break him out of the matrix, he still had his subjective mental experience kind of the whole time. And then when he plugs himself back into the matrix to save Morpheus, he's once again having a subjective mental experience. The difference is he knows his subjective experiences aren't corresponding to real things in the later half of the movie, whereas the first half of the movie, he just didn't know his subjective experiences weren't doing this. So merely having subjective mental experiences and taking ownership of them isn't really the bulwark against skepticism I think that Descartes thinks it is.
Well, it's not just having those, right? You know you have those, but you also know that there is a you there, okay? Right? There's a you there, which Descartes doesn't really fully work out, but Kant works a little bit more with the unity of apperception. There are certain things that we can know about this mind, and one of the ones that I thought was extremely important was the incorrigibility one, which means that there is some part of you that isn't limited to the matrix, because this whole system could be doubted. And based on Leibniz's law, anything that's dubitable is not identical to something that is.
I think that's an interesting thought. There's some part of you that isn't limited to the matrix. I mean, if somebody's born in the matrix, lives in the matrix, and dies in the matrix, never knowing there's anything outside of the matrix, it seems to me like for all intents and purposes, I mean, everything that was them was basically a construct of the matrix. You have to break out of it before you can start seeing yourself as separate from the system.
Well, okay, we can make two distinctions here. We can make a distinction between a actual reality and a practical reality. So you're giving me the example of a practical reality. Well, this person is either unaware or by choice, or maybe just could never be made aware of this for a variety of contingent reasons. What does it matter? Well, what it matters is, in the broader sense, is if we run with this line of reasoning, and then we combine some of these insights, not just Descartes, but also Kant's. One of the things that Descartes concludes with his Meditations is that God exists, God with all the omni properties, and we've already covered the rationalist, the Empiricist Dilemma, so I won't belabor that again here. If you can create, if you accept in principle the concept of a priori reasoning, and then believe that there is this sort of, like, again, I'll just say Plato's realm of the forms that exists over and above the world we're in, you can literally build Jacob's ladder out of here. That's the thing I'm saying. You can know that there's this thing out there above us, that if maybe you have the right kind of insight, or maybe you have the right kind of imagination, you can build your ladder out, and then hopefully, using Plato's cave analogy, climb back down into the cave to help other people get out.
I think the difficulty there from the perspective of the empiricist, I mean, I'm a Platonist, so you're preaching to the choir, so don't take this as me arguing with you. But I think from the perspective of an empiricist, the trick with this question is, let's suppose you have a whole bunch of people building ladders to a bunch of different things outside reality. And some of them are mutually contradictory. Like these two outside realities can't be both true together. And so you've built these two different ladders to these different contradictory realities. And my reality is the right one. I'm going to come down here and bust you out of the cave. No, mine is, I'm going to come down here and bust you out of the cave, right? We have a disagreement. We have to resolve it. And let's suppose both systems are internally consistent. This is a problem that's been run into since time immemorial in philosophy. And it was really, really hit again in philosophy of science with Peirce and pragmatism. And so the empiricist is going to say, well, look, if you've got these two abstract, internally consistent views that can't both be true at the same time, one of two things is going to happen. Either when you project them back down, there's going to be some fact that they're not consistent within the world. And so we can say, aha, you predict this fact about the world. And so we know we can discount you, because in order to climb back down, you actually have to climb back down. You have to climb back down and account for all the facts we do know, and you couldn't. Sorry, you're out. But if both of them are consistent with all the same facts of the world, and they're an abstract land where you can't really actually breach and test things or whatever, and they're internally consistent and they're contradictory, this is the point where the empiricist, especially the pragmatist kind, is just going to say, I'm just not going to climb either ladder because neither of you can actually resolve the disagreement. And none of what you're saying has any practical application on where I'm at, right? You haven't been able to come down to the ladder to get me because you're trying to pull me up in two different directions and I can't go two different directions. So what am I going to do?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of ways to untangle that. I think ultimately, if you follow lines of reasoning long enough, I think that there won't be very many of those cases. Actually, I think, given that I wanted to establish, in a separate discussion, I edited a Substack article where I tried to establish what I called mere monotheism, arguing against polytheism, going back to a discussion I had with somebody at the Little Glory Club to sort of stimulate conversation and get things going. I think if you can get to mere monotheism through these sort of like abstract principles, and then you're going to have some problems because there's a few dominant monotheistic religions you have to compete with. So I would argue that there probably won't be that many, but once you get to that point, you will have to use other tools. I mean, I don't believe you can, a priori prove all the doctrines of Christianity, for example. What I'm trying to lay out here is a justification for why we have reasoning processes at all, and what does that tell us about the world? Because if you don't believe we have some sort of sense of innate ideas or a priori synthetic reasoning, then we have to start over every single time, and we can't make progress because we just have to. Well, I didn't test it with my senses. Well, okay, we're back to square one, guys. Got to keep doing it over again.
Mm-hmm.
No, I mean that's the point. Then we wouldn't go anywhere if we did that. So.
Okay. Yeah.
But I guess the really important, emotionally important part of the argument is this: for whatever reason, the empiricist, and I would argue in virtue of him being an empiricist, lacks a certain level of consciousness that he's not really able to understand. In an analogous fashion to if you were to tell a child the workings of a complex machine, the child wouldn't understand. Now, that's not necessarily because the child is stupid. It's because the child lacks certain things that as he gets older and becomes a man, he will possess, which will allow him to then understand what you're trying to tell him.
Right.
And I think that's part of the problem. Because I mean, if we look at like I'll bring it back to something you've mentioned before in other streams. The concept of free will, right? You've kind of inadvertently started converting me to compatibilism because you're like, well, libertarian free will seems to be a problem. And you're like, well, give me an example, Logos. And you gave me the example of the feminist. And I'm like, oh, darn it, Logos. You're convincing me of compatibilism. But the people who can't do it later on in life from some maximally plastic point of their mental development, especially if it's because of conditioning, that's just a defect on their part.
I'm sorry. What's a defect on their part?
If
understanding the machine.
Yeah, if they lack the mental plasticity to do this because of a set of conditioned events. So, for example, imagine somebody that grew up in the Soviet Union, right? There's a lot of things they're just not going to even entertain, which a reasonable person. You would expect a reasonable person to be able to entertain.
Right. I get the idea. I just didn't know what the particular it was.
Okay.
It's the machine, the child looking at the machine, right?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I think overall we agree on that one.
All right, cool. Now I know I asked you to sort of come at it from the opposing side. So just as before we wrap up and deal with some of the chat, what would you say briefly or broadly as Logos, not as Logos, the surrogate empiricist?
Oh, about what we've talked about so far?
Yeah, because like I said, I had you on to get in to put on the other guy's hat, but just to
okay, yeah. So cards on the table about my position. I would say philosophy of mind. I'm probably a monist. I don't know if I'm a property dualist monist or a dual aspect monist because I don't really understand the difference between aspects and properties. I think that the brain is really, really, really important. I think the big thing that won me over to some type of monism, personally, was just the relationship between blunt force trauma in the brain, like MK Ultra, like mind control experiments in the brain, like the fact that we can alter people's brains and make them hallucinate, do things, see things. It's pretty big. And so it's like the other thing that really interested me. I can't talk. I don't know why. Interested me about this. There we go. Is the timeless aspect, right? Plausibly, God is in time with creation, but with when souls go to be with God, it seems there's an internally consistent model where souls become timeless when they are one with God and outside of creation, either before they're born or maybe in like the very end of times or something like that. And I'm thinking about it, I'm like, what is a timeless mental process going to be like? And I don't think it's anything like what you're like right now, because you're hearing things, you're deliberating things, you're taking in new information, you're thinking. And so that got me thinking about the timeless you versus the mental tensed you. And the biggest difference is one of them is the physical brain being essential to that process. The other one is absent, the physical brain and body. So I think the me that's here right now would be very different than soul me. And I think the brain is very, very essential to that. But I think there are a lot of things that that materialists get wrong. Mental properties. So if we want to say something like mind control is immoral, it's like, why? I mean, if even if not like analytically identically speaking, mind states are identical to brain states. No matter how you try to reduce things down and talk to them about them from an emergentist perspective, a grounding perspective, whatever, if you're bringing them back to physical facts, there's no moral fact to the matter about physical facts. You run into the old is odd, right? Is it immoral to boil water? Is it immoral to run electrical current, right? And if all you are is just, in some sense, an arrangement of physical chemicals, from where do we get things like mind control is wrong or something like that? And that didn't sit well with me. So it's, at the very least, whatever this mind brain system we have here is, it has properties that can't be fully physicalized. And so there'll always be part of this, I think, that materialists aren't quite getting when they think about it. I don't know that I'd go so far. Well, here's where it's tricky. Like I said, I think there could be soul me, and that's where you would get the dualistic aspect. But in a sense, like the forms, it'd be timeless, right? Because I'm kind of a Platonist. I think the forms timelessly necessarily exist. And so I would have to exist in that way, but I wouldn't recognize it at all. So I could be me dualistically, but I don't think that way would describe me here now. So it's kind of complicated. So that's the first thing on like philosophy of mind.
No, but oh yeah, sorry, keep going. That was just that. Okay, I thought that was all of it, but keep going.
Oh yeah. So the next part is the Empiricist Dilemma. I think we kind of went over that pretty good. I'm a pragmatist, and so I believe in some sense in innate ideas. I can pronounce in twice. I believe in some sense in that. And so to the extent that I'm at least a methodological naturalist, so to speak, or whatever, I don't think I could ever be a strong empiricist to deny the dilemma. And I think that we think of these things about God like aseity and things like that because they have some sort of utility. I like the arguments that have been made recently, like evolutionary psychology and stuff, that say the idea of like this abstract essay being that's not caused by something else existed to, in some sense, ground the laws outside of a person. Because that's really, really important. Because if you ground the laws in a person and you don't like the laws, you kill the person, there go the laws, and that just results in civilizational upheaval. But if you have laws that transcend any one singular person, then you're good to go. And I think that opens the door for Christianity. I'm very, very sensitive to arguments about the practicality of Christianity. We've talked about this a whole bunch. Moses' laws did pretty good for the Israelites, actually. And societies that have, used them to some degree have done pretty well. So, okay, that's a pretty good feather in the cap for Christianity. And so when looking at that from a practical perspective, I think there's a really interesting conversation to be had there. It's not just any laws that transcend a person. It's these laws out of all the laws we could make. What they do, pull them out of a hat? I mean, lucky guesses, So that's the second one. The third one, I think for the grounding argument for empiricism, I think we ended up agreeing just fully on that one as a matter of course. I just kind of had to wear my empiricist hat through the whole thing. So
yeah, that's great. So we'll just wrap it up. We have one super chat from Middleton Walker, $4.99 US. Thank you very much. You guys always have such a pleasing energy. Thanks for the mental break from my workday banalities. So
You're welcome.
You're welcome. Well, thanks, Logos. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise and Folly podcast, signing off.